What advice would you give Frank when he starts feeling bad that whenever we post something on social media, it gets a lot more likes when I'm doing more of the talking than the ones where he's doing the talking? Because his engagement sucks.
I'm just here to help Ian's ego. You don't even wade into these waters.
You're not part of
a lot of angst and dread.
Frank, you're not part of the machine, man. Sorry, Ian, you're a sellout. I know that means something to you because we're all the same age. No one cares about that anymore, by the way. I mean, I am really into being
just
me. No one cares about being a sellout.
You're listening to Let Me Speak to a Manager with Frank Cava and Ian Matthews.
What a crock of shit.
Yeah, that was hot mic, Sam.
You can't say God on the air.
Don't worry, nobody's listening anyway.
Do it live! I'll write it and we'll do it live!
Frankie!
Ian, you son of a bitch!
I am an anxious son of a bitch today, and we're going to talk about why. We have a guest, which is rare. Our listeners will know that, but you've got to be pretty special to be a guest on this podcast, and you've got to be really special to get us to do more than 20 minutes of half-ass internet research to prepare. And both Frank and I read an entire book and spent 2 hours preparing for this. So we've got something special for everyone today, don't we, Frankie?
We're very excited.
So we have with us today Dr. Tracy Dennis-Tiwary, Ph.D., professor of psychology, neuroscience at Hunter College. She also directs the Emotion Regulation Lab and is a co-founder of the digital therapeutics company Wise Therapeutics. So she is a startup founder right in the mix. She's a writer. She's got all kinds of degrees. She's been published on New York Times, Washington Post, CBS. I mean, we had to really snow her to think that we had a real show to get her to come on, because she is a special guest. Welcome, Tracy.
Ian, Frank, great to be with you guys.
It's awesome. So Tracy completely freaked us out. We're here on Zoom, and
I can redo it if you want.
We admitted her into the room, and there's just like an open
empty chair.
Room.
Here, watch.
It's dead quiet, and then she just popped in. Hey guys! She got us anxious right out of the gate. But the main reason why we asked Tracy to come on our show is her book. She wrote a book which is future tense, as you can see, and the subtitle is Why Anxiety is Good for You, Even Though It Feels Bad. And so I heard Tracy on another podcast, because when you write a book, you go on as many podcasts as you can to get the word out there. And I thought to myself, this is a fascinating topic, not only because in my career I've had to deal with anxiety over and over, and I'm still deal with it on a regular basis, but my kids deal with it. I have a 9 and 11-year-old, and it's tough being a kid. It's stressful. So I'm always talking to them about anxiety, and we'll get into that at some point, but I think I've been talking to one of them wrong about anxiety, that the good doctor could do some coaching. But this is how I was introduced, and I bought the book, I read it, and I said, Frankie, we have to have her on. And we're lucky that you came on. So thank you.
Oh, thanks so much. I'm grateful to be with you guys.
And Frank is realizing that Tracy is very much like Frankie's wife in more ways than one, just from our prep.
My wife's a professor at the University of Richmond. She teaches Spanish and linguistics. She got her PhD from Georgetown, and in the time it took Ian and I to get a couple of hangovers in college, she ended up with an undergrad, like a master's. It's incredible. So I'll start with a quick story. I told her that we were doing this podcast today, and she was going through the peer review process, which, do you want to explain what the peer review process is?
It's a form of masochism that we all subject ourselves to in science to serve the greater good, which is to get great science out there. So we scientists in a given field, for free, we agree to review other people's science so that it's held to a certain standard. We see if there are any problems, help people improve it, or say it's not fit to be print, so to speak.
And my wife
Miserable,
works on
yeah.
this a bunch because she requires to be published enough at her
Wow.
university. So this is a big thing, right? So I was
Yeah,
like,
and it's an honor to be a peer reviewer, although I think it's just a bit of a con to get us to all do all this work for free. That's a different conversation, but it's a wonderful system. It's the community of science, but it can be brutal. I mean, you get those reviewers who just, they're out for blood and not really out necessarily to make the science better.
So my wife wrote an article, she submitted it, and then I go, what are you up to today? And she goes, oh, I'm in the peer review process. I go, I don't know this language. Tell me what you mean. She goes, I have to do that dance now, telling a manuscript reviewer that I appreciate all their incredible insights and my manuscript will be much improved now that I have incorporated their suggestions. When in reality, what I think is they're a self-important, agenda-pushing, careless reader who has missed the point altogether. And what I want to say is, F you. Now my article is a Franken study where your suggestions are add-ons that detract from my main point.
And where it becomes fun is that in your response to the editor and to the reviewers, you can have coded language that essentially says that, so that you can be passive aggressive and very polite. But you're essentially letting everyone know what you think.
Her close, all because I want to appease them. And if I don't, my article is unlikely to be published.
No, it's a dance. It's a dance. I feel her. I feel her. So please send her my condolences and empathy.
I will.
So we are going to learn all about anxiety today, and try to get you to think about it in different terms than I think the world paints it today. But in the acknowledgments of future tense, Tracy, you wrote this. Writing this book was one of the hardest and most satisfying things I've ever done. The only thing I can compare it to is seeing my son through the treatment of his congenital heart condition, ending with open heart surgery. That is a big thing to compare writing a book for. And I write, so, I write for Forbes, and I write for my businesses. I write the copy for
He writes for me.
Advertise. I write for Frankie. I write to our investors in our real estate. But I know as a writer, it is a very lonely, anxious thing to do, and it's you're always second guessing yourself. You're never good enough. At least that's how I feel at the time. I remember the first article I wrote for Forbes. I must have spent 8 hours editing that thing and re-looking at it, and I grew over time to relax. But so many people start books. So many people think they want to write a book or have an idea for a book, or start writing it for years and never finish it. Talk about how anxiety played a role in forcing you to get that book published.
That's a great question, because and this is, as you say, kind of the core message of my book, that maybe we have the wrong idea about anxiety, because we often would assume, well, anxiety is what stops us from writing that book. Anxiety is what, it blocked me. It made me work so hard on that Forbes article, and it's kind of this problem that needs to be solved. It's a dysfunction that needs to be fixed. But I would turn that around, because anxiety, it's not fear, right? That freezes you in the present, right? It's not this sort of, when you're fearful, it helps you cope with, certain threats, some danger you're facing. Anxiety sends you into the possible future. It makes you into a mental time traveler. It helps you know that something bad could happen. You could not get that Forbes article accepted. But if you work hard, you actually still have a shot at getting that Forbes article published. So what anxiety is priming us to do is to work for this future we want, to make our dreams come true, avert disaster, and make the positive outcomes into reality. So when you think of it that way, and we think about the writing process, anxiety is that thing that made you work for 8 hours on that article until it was good enough. Anxiety is that thing that when I was writing Future Tense, I got the book deal right before the pandemic. I mean, weeks before the pandemic in 2020. And then I was writing it in the middle of the pandemic, and wrote for 6, 7, 8 months. And once I got some real feedback from my editor, they essentially told me, this sucks, throw it all out. So I then,
of course,
I then had to start from the beginning. And it was only my anxiety, I think, because I really cared about this book. You're only anxious when you care. It was that anxiety that made me persist, and took this really significant obstacle and say, okay, I need to do something different. I need to write this differently. I need to get some support. I hired an amazing editor named Bill Tonelli, who said, okay, we're going to start with a blank page, Tracy. Explain your ideas to me. I don't know anything. Start from the beginning. And in that hard process, this book was, I think, 100 times better than it would have been if I hadn't been through it. But anxiety was my helpmate. Anxiety is what kept pushing me forward. Just like, honestly, when my son, when my son was born with this heart condition that we knew would require open heart surgery, I needed that anxiety to say, hey, I have to do everything I can to work to make sure he's healthy, to get the best treatment. But I also have to hope that there's an actual good outcome at the end of that. I'm not despairing yet. When you're anxious, you're still in it to win it. So that's why when we think about anxiety this way, instead of a blocker, we can start to figure out how to leverage it, to use it, to channel it. And I think as a writer, I mean, it's one of the best assets we have, because it also makes us really precise, keep working at it, getting it right, and not giving up.
And so when you tell everyone, when you get a book deal, right before COVID, is there a deadline? Is there, are there dates certain that you have to go, or the deal's off?
Yeah.
So, and how does that play a role in motivating you to move past, work through some of the anxious moments?
Yeah, sometimes it's those deadlines and that, I can't put my head in the sand sort of anxiety that really gets us focused. So for a book like this, so I had I needed to deliver the manuscript by, oh God, what was the date? I think it was a year from that point, right? And if I had gotten that feedback and said, sorry, I just can't do this, I'm going to return my advance, that would have been it. But I said, okay, I'm going to rethink this book. I'm going to hire that editor. I'm going to ask for an extension on the deadline. And I got it. So we had some more time, but I needed that deadline to keep working towards. And we knew then, working backwards, like, when you make lists, when you make plans, if you just avert all the tension of that, you're not going to be organized. You're not going to be focused. And Bill and I, we had a schedule. Every 2 weeks, I had to turn over a new chapter from scratch. It had to be done. And then we moved on to the next one. Month after month after month, we did it for 9 months or whatever it was. It was anxiety that kept me focused on what those goals were, frankly.
And as a writer, an editor is really just a coach, right? It's another way of saying a coach. You're a writing coach. He's giving you input on what you wrote. He's helping you tailor it differently. He's giving you ideas and helping move you along. But as I hear you explain that, and I think about in the business world, we always have different projects we're working on, but I hear 3 distinct things there. You had a big deadline. You hired a coach who helped keep you accountable, move your way through it, just like having a workout partner. And then you broke that big goal into smaller goals. You broke it into 2 and 3 week goals where all right, I can't write an entire book in 2 weeks, but I can damn sure write a chapter and get it to my editor. And writers kind of talk about the shitty first draft, just get a draft, get it on paper, and just keep editing and making it shorter and making it more concise. But those are the 3 big things I just heard that I think anyone listening to this, if you have a big goal, Tracy, you were great about this. You put yourself out there. You by going and getting that deal, you had a commitment now you had to live up to. And that was, you're not the kind of person that's, I gave the introduction of who you are. You're not the kind of person that would just quit. You found a coach and you broke that big goal into small goals. That's really incredible.
No, that's a beautiful breakdown of it. And, the interesting thing too about anxiety and these goals is we do think that anxiety chokes us, but there's this concept that I wrote about in the book called excellencism. And it's sort of,
I can't wait to talk about that.
Yeah. I don't know if now's the time, but in a nutshell, it's, perfectionism we know is toxic. It's like the standard of flawlessness that always leads to worse outcomes. It blocks us. It's never good enough. But excellencism is this pursuit of excellence. But knowing that you have to fail along the way to get there and that you have to break it down. And anxiety actually makes us more excellencist. It actually focuses us on really, what? I want to do my best. Maybe I'm a little anxious about it, but I can do my best. I am empowered to fail, pick myself back up and keep going. So I think that what you described as breaking it down, but also thinking about that pursuit of excellence, I think that's a secret to success, frankly.
There's something in here that I'm really excited to talk about, and it's deadlines, right? So Ian and I are now in our 40s, and we're over the fact that we're adolescents at any point. But for basically the entire decade of our 30s, every binge diet that we ever went on was because we wanted to go to a pool in Vegas and we didn't want to embarrass ourselves.
I'm getting a good sense of you guys now. Okay, I'm taking this in. This is good.
These were the motivators. Like,
whatever it takes.
Chapters, we go on starvation diets to only be slightly fatter when we get to Vegas.
Which we need to get a Vegas trip on the books. If that was actually something that worked for us, we should put it on the books right now. Lose a few pounds.
Quite soon. Ian, I kind of want to stick on excellenceism if we can.
Sure.
I know it's a little later in the book, it's chapter 8, but so I'll tell a story. I led with my wife, right? Like, when I read this book, I kept sharing excerpts with her because this is the life she leads, right? My wife and her sister are both very, very intelligent people, but my wife is just slightly smarter. And my wife is like valedictorian. My wife like had scholarships. Like, my wife has gone the academic career. We went back for her 20th high school reunion. She grew up in South Carolina. Someone asked her what she was up to, and the woman just kind of looked at her, nodded, and goes, "That fits." Like, it fits her perfectly. Like that's her life.
Yeah.
So in the excellence, that whole theme, my wife, before hashtag anything was popular, her sister always bought her things that had excellence written on it. So there's like excellence t-shirts and excellence coffee mugs, and like, so this whole thing, I really thought it was fascinating because it's kind of a joke in our household, but it's I think it's really a way that you can chase things with a very high standard, but understand that you're not. It's just, there's always an opposite side of it. Nothing is perfect. Like, it's only whitewashed if it's perfect. I would love you to explain that concept, because I really thought that was incredible.
Yeah. So, there's that quote from Thomas Edison, who was perhaps an iconic excellencist. He said, "I have not failed. I have just found 10,000 ways that don't work yet." So what does that illustrate for us? It illustrates that failure is not a destination. It's a process on this journey. It also illustrates that sometimes you have to build imperfect things to get to really good things. It illustrates that you can wrap your head around sometimes things are good enough. When you're a perfectionist, you have this standard of flawlessness. It's binary. It's like you're 100% or you're 0. So what does that do? It actually causes more mental health problems because it really is toxic. It actually gets people to produce fewer good things,
right,
of lower quality, in part because you don't know when it's good enough. It's the law of diminishing returns. So you might be working on a paper or an article, and if you're so caught up in this perfectionistic imaginary, standard that you have, you won't know when it's actually really awesome. And maybe then it's time to bring in your editor, social support, people who you can get advice from, and it's harder to also draw on one of our greatest resources as humans, which is other humans. So so perfectionism blocks you, but excellenceism doesn't. Excellenceism promotes keeping at it, making it better each time, finding new innovative ways around, bringing in your social community, knowing I'm going to get the best editor, or with my son, I'm going to get the best cardiothoracic surgeon. I'm going to, so it just keeps you. I feel like anything I've done in my life that's really worked, it's because I have this characteristic of being an excellencist a lot of the time.
Ian and I spent a lot of our time in this podcast talking about careers. And there's this, the excellencist part to me was like the perfect kind of summary of what you think you are in your late teens, your early 20s. And we're both in our mid to late 40s at this point. Like, we no longer chase that elusive thing. And it's the elusiveness is like, I need to be incredible at everything. And like, I've had people ask me questions that are like, how do you do so much? It's like, because I don't do it, because I do so little. Because but it's the truth. I have 50 people that work here, and if you don't have those people doing all of those things, but it's the same thing. It's like when you lean into having an expert, it doesn't mean you're weak because, or you're not smart. It means you're smart enough to realize I'm not great at this, and there's someone better.
I love that point, Frank, and because it's also sort of, and not to pivot totally to anxiety, because we've been talking about anxiety, because when you're anxious, you're going to keep striving. Anxiety is that fuel that helps us strive. It doesn't mean you have to white knuckle it through or suffer, but it's that little frisson, it's that little like, ooh, I want this. That's anxiety. And we're doing mental health wrong in general, And anxiety is the prime case study because we've decided it blocks us. We've decided that that discomfort of failing or that pain that we feel when it's, when we're just like wrapped up in that article and I just, is Forbes are they gonna take it? Are they not gonna take it? Should I do this alone or should I draw? When we're wrapped up in that, we think it's a blocker or destructive. We'll never go through it. We'll just keep on going around it and losing opportunities. And so we don't see that actually anxiety, if we think of it as an ally that we need to negotiate with, like any ally, it's going to be this powerhouse for us. It's going to be this source of strength, not a source of weakness and a signal that we're broken. And that's the conversation. That's the conversation.
When I think of a perfectionist, I saw that you have a review on the back of your book from Angela Duckworth. So her book Grit talks about the growth mindset versus the fixed mindset. And whenever I hear someone tell me they're a perfectionist and they're just missing things or not getting things done, I just think of someone with a fixed mindset whose ego won't let them fail, whose ego won't let them put something out and iterate and practice and learn from it. You can't be a perfectionist and start a company. You can't, because you have to test things with customers who might tell you it sucks. It might tell you that's not good.
And if you don't take that feedback, you're going to fail because it's so important to be able to take that.
Yeah. And they see failure as a mark on them, that's permanent, where someone with a growth mindset sees failure as just part of the process. Like we got to fail it as many times as we can until we get to something that works. So I don't know. I've always just thought of that as maybe it's anxiety, but I've always thought of the perfectionist as just their ego gets in the way and they have a limited mindset versus someone with a growth mindset that gets better because they're like, screw it. I'll keep failing.
I think you're right. I think that is all mindset. And I think anxiety is sort of secondary to that, or sometimes it's like part of it. But I mean, in some ways, I think, we could lose the term anxiety and we could use the term mindset. When it comes to my book, even I even start the whole book saying, this is not a self-help book in the traditional sense. What the sole goal of this book is to ask you to consider thinking differently about anxiety, shifting your mindset and going from it being this sign of danger and damage to a sign that you're actually ready to expand your limits. You're ready to grow. You're going into the future. And, I'll just briefly describe this beautiful study that illustrates this to a T. It was a study coming out of Harvard, 2013, Jameson and colleagues. And they've expanded this work. So this has been replicated and they just published a paper in Nature, which was amazing. And in it, what they did is they brought socially anxious people into the lab and they had them do something that's kryptonite for someone who's socially anxious because you fear negative evaluation from others. They had them give an impromptu speech. It's called the Trier Social Stress Test. But they did one thing to half of the group. They taught those folks who are socially anxious. I mean, this is a clinical disorder. They taught them to think differently about their anxiety as they prep to give that speech. So they said, yes, your heart's going to race. You're going to feel terrible, but that's not you getting ready to fail. That's you getting ready to perform at your best because your heart is racing to put oxygen into your brain. Your body's ready to focus. You're bringing it. That's what these feelings are. And the other half of the group, they didn't give that reframe. And don't you know, when they actually measured performance during the speech, they measured heart rate, they measured blood pressure. Those people who were taught to shift their mindset about stress and anxiety just this little bit for 15, 20 minutes, they had lower blood pressure, lower heart rates, and they did better. This was this micro intervention. And this is something we can repeat in our lives every day when we're about to face a challenge. And that's about mindset.
I love that. So let's
hold on. I have to say something. I didn't realize the back jacket cover was fair game for this interview. So now that Ian has introduced the subject, I have to talk about who's below Angela Duckworth. And you went to Alanis Morissette, which is a stroke of just genius. Because there's nothing that has more angst in it than maybe the album I listened to hers from college.
Jagged Little Pill.
I mean, we're of the right age. I'm in my late 40s. I'm pushing 50. And so, yes, she was a part of our youth. And and she's an amazing person. My husband is a Broadway producer and produced Jagged Little Pill on Broadway, which is now on tour. Awesome. So that was Alanis was very generous to read the book and give me that quote. So thank you for pointing.
As soon as I saw it, like, all right, we got to talk about that.
Yeah, she's amazing.
So let's
Ian,
define, Frankie, let's define anxiety from Tracy from the book. Anxiety is what we feel when something bad could happen, but hasn't happened yet. And the question I wanted to ask you, Tracy, what is the difference then between anxiety and fear?
Right. That's the
And
crucial
is there a
distinction.
difference? Is there a difference?
Yeah, there is, and it's hard to make sometimes because they feel the same a lot of the time, right? And so we just sort of equate them. So it's really the difference is really why I call this book future tense. So fear is present certainty that you're facing a danger. It's clear and present danger. There's no uncertainty. It's gonna happen. It's someone holding a knife to your throat. That is fear. And fear, like all emotions, are adaptive. It primes us to respond in a way that can help us. That's why Darwin wrote about emotions, and it was a major part of his theory. And so fear prepares us to fight, take flight, or freeze, right? But anxiety has nothing to do with the present tense. It's all about the future. It makes us into these mental time travelers, as I mentioned. You're looking around the bend. You're waiting for those medical tests to come back. You're waiting to see if your article was, accepted. You're waiting to see how your son's, open heart surgery is going to go when he's 4 months old. Like, that is anxiety. And it's not just that the bad thing hasn't happened yet, but the possibility of good still exists, because otherwise you would despair. Mm. So that's the power of anxiety, that the flip side of anxiety is hope.
I love that. So whenever I think about anxiety, or I think about, well, my gut is telling me to go act on something. I think gut is similar to anxiety a little bit.
Yeah, definitely.
When people say don't listen to your gut, I always say that's terrible advice, because we're here on this planet right now because some caveman, thousands of years ago didn't go into that cave when his gut was saying don't go in. So the way you kind of described it, anxiety is, what if there's a bear in that dark cave that I want to go into? And fear is, there's a bear in our campsite trying to eat me. Like,
that's exactly right.
Immediate and certain fear is like, holy shit, there's a bear. I gotta run or hit it with a rock. And anxiety is, what if a bear came? And that anxiety would make me create weapons, build a campfire, do things that I still could control to get the bear to go. And if I hadn't done those things and the bear was there, that's just fear. Like, I'm screwed. I got to try to outrun this thing.
I'll cite you, as every good academic would, Frank. I will cite you, but I'm going to totally take that example because it's a perfect example of the difference. And it's why I say that we would not have civilization if it weren't for anxiety, because it requires that very unique triumph of human evolution, which is our simulation machine called the prefrontal cortex, which allows us to imagine in exquisite detail what that future could be, that there could be a bear in that cave. And what would it take to deal with that bear? How do we make plans to anticipate that bear? Or how do we make plans that we might find some, nourishing something or other, or a safe place? How can anxiety allows us to see that cave could also be a shelter. And so this is why to say that anxiety is always a disorder, and sometimes it is, and that can be a discussion we go into, or to say that the emotion of anxiety means we're broken or needs to be fixed, it's just wrong. And it's actually an opportunity cost for all of these reasons, because we're taking as a disadvantage something that is a profound advantage.
Ian, I want to lean into this a little bit, and this way, like we've evolved. We've talked about the cave, right? We no longer live in those. I'm guessing you live in New York. You live in a vertical building. So that being the case, what is it about society that has caused us to turn our back to these things that have helped get us here? Like there is a lean in to anxiety, and I think if you learn how to harness it, it can fuel you. But you talk a lot about like the Sacklers, and we talk a lot about Dope Sick, and a lot of that was filmed in my backyard, and I have family members who've suffered from it. So like I paid attention to it, and I don't want to put, I'm not good enough and I don't understand the subject matter as well as you do, but I thought that was a really interesting kind of juxtaposition. I'll say one thing and I'll have you kind of take it. I'm an old dad. I'm 47 and I have a 3-year-old. But I know how to manage. And what I do, I realize my son goes to daycare and he's around other 3-year-olds, and I'm not there, and he seems to come home quite happy. So like when I go to the park with them, like I'll sit on a stool like 50 feet away, and like when I'm making sure of like no real bodily harm or no one's putting them in a bag and taking them in a van, like but like the rest of it, as long as they're inside the fence, like go have fun, like figure it out. But I feel like there's the helicopter parenting kind of a thing, and then there's this thing of like we just don't want there, right, we don't want there to be anything other than this utopic existence, and it's really doing a disservice to almost everybody.
It's a huge disservice. There's so much in what you said, Frank. I'll start with one idea, and then we can talk about kids too, because it's something, you know, that's very near and dear to my heart. I'm also an old mom. I'm 49 and I have a 10 and 13-year-old, so a little older than your 3-year-old. I remember 3. That was something. So the first thing about what are the societal forces that have shifted us to really reject anxiety? They're old forces. And really starting, as I kind of outline in the book, with with the medieval church, and how anxiety went from being sort of this bodily thing,
right,
to the domain of the soul and the domain of then later the mind, as the Enlightenment happened and you started to develop these philosophies and science, and then really with the advent of psychology as a discipline, to decide, well, wait a second, these emotions like anxiety, this emotional life, the emotional suffering, we apply a disease model to it. We're going to medicalize it. And that created wonderful advances. But the problem is that the disease model, this medical model of mental illness, it doesn't work. And 100 years of failure, because we have great science and solutions, but mental health problems are not on the downturn. And it's not just awareness. It's not just that we're noticing more. I think the best data suggests that they're actually on the rise. And in part, it's because we've equated mental health, like in the kind of a medical model, with the absence of emotional discomfort, much like we equate physical health with the absence of, having COVID or having cancer. It's like this, it's almost like an infectious disease model, that you can't have these difficult emotions or these challenges, or it means that you're broken, just like with a physical disease. But that's wrong, because and this is from Angela Duckworth's quote, actually on the back of my book, anxiety and all of our difficult emotions are a feature of being human. They're not a bug. They're not a malfunction. They don't need to be fixed. They need to be like a skill worked with and through. And so, and actually Tom Insel himself, who ran the NIMH, the National Institute of Mental Health, for over a decade, controlled $22 billion worth of research funding, of which I was a recipient. He had kind of gone into the Silicon Valley world now, and he wrote a book and gave an interview at the Aspen Ideas Festival 3 weeks ago, where he said, the disease model of mental illness doesn't work. This was the guy who was the king of that model. This was the guy who control, and believe me, you don't get funding from the NIMH unless you buy into this disease model and approach to treating mental illness. So we have a big problem in terms of the larger societal forces and how we think about mental health and how we talk about it. And then there's kids. How are we talking about them? But let you jump in, Ian. Yeah.
How long has our society even used the word anxiety to describe these feelings? Because I think if you asked multiple people what anxiety meant to them, I think you would get different answers.
It's a great point. And even like I will use it loosely to mean the same as fear, or to mean the same as worry, or to mean the same, right? And worry is sort of,
and you did that with your kids. I think one was in like 3rd grade, one was in like, I don't remember the exact ages, but they had very different expectations around what it was.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, right. When I asked them, oh, you guys really did read the book. Thank you. You're getting examples I forgot about.
Oh yeah. with highlighters, pens.
We do not have handlers. And like we actually did all the work. We highlighted it.
Right. So right. So it means different things. I mean, the first time we even started using it as an internal experience was when the anxiety that the Catholic Church talked about in medieval, in the Dark Ages, when it tried to kind of leverage this notion of the dark night of the soul and anxiety and angst. So in your anxiety, seek out, God's comfort, because hellfire is on the other side. And so that's the first time it became this sort of internal process. And then we started using it, really, you can say philosophically with like Kant and other people, but really you have to look at Freud. And Freud, and in the German, when he wrote about anxiety, that real translation is angst. which is not the same as anxiety. Angst is this sort of existential experience. But we really started in the English language using it in the domain of mental illness when Freudian theory got out there, and then as psychology grew in the United States and Europe and beyond. So it is kind of newish, but it's always been this bugaboo. It's been this demon on our shoulder from the time that the church talked about it, something to be frightened of. The foul fiend of fear is one of the first sort of pseudo-psychiatric manuals by Burton talked about anxiety as this foul fiend of fear.
I can never get over, whenever anyone cites Freud, I can just never get over the fact that he prescribed everything as you wanted to hump your mom. Like, I feel like it always got back to that. I just felt like he was a weird dude. It's hard for me to, for me to get too deep into Freudian concepts.
Yeah, same. I mean, I
like
respect
everything, even in your book, you talk
but...
about it. Every study you would get into is
like
well,
Rat Man.
Feelings about, yeah, Rat Man. Well, you liked your mom. Like, everything is the same thing. It's weird.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we don't have to go down that rabbit hole necessarily, but I think, think about how this was, very restricted, morally, emotionally restricted period in Victorian, this sort of, this high society of Vienna, and all of these people he treated were extremely repressed. And this is, in a sense, they had the same approach to difficult emotions as we do today, where what we aspire to is to be comfortably numb. And this really, Frank, goes into what you were saying too,
right,
about the opioid crisis being, I think, hand in hand with this sort of benzodiazepine crisis, where we have a real, one we're not talking about nearly enough. We have a serious problem with addiction and overdose death with the main anti-anxiety medication out there. It's really, it's the third leading cause to death after opioids, benzodiazepine overdose deaths.
Wow.
I mean, it is a huge problem. We don't prepare people to actually understand the risks. It's overprescribed. It's a huge industry. And we don't understand that it's actually also meant to be, some people can really benefit from it. When you have an anxiety disorder, it's not just that you're anxious, it's that the way you're coping with anxiety is causing functional impairment. It's getting in the way of working, of loving, of creating.
But I think, I think anxiety gets such a bad rap in that you said it's a feature, and I like that. It's one of our superpowers. It's anxiety, if you think of it that of something to lean in and not to avoid. You talk about how this is right from the book. When we are anxious, our attention narrows, we become more focused, and we become more detail oriented. Positive emotions do the opposite. They broaden our focus and make us less attentive. And I thought of this. There's a quote that people say in business all the time, that if you want to get something done, give it to the busiest person on your team.
Yeah, exactly.
That's
and the most anxious person.
yeah. And it's true though. It's true. I've been the busiest person on the team, and my boss kept giving me stuff. And I always felt like the more deadlines I had and the more I had on my plate, the more on top of things were, the more I got and I always felt like if I was less busy, if I'd go through a really busy period and then things would slow way down, I wasn't as sharp. I would miss some deadlines. I wouldn't be on top of things as much.
Yeah.
I always felt like the busier I was, the more on top of things I was. And I think that comes down to when we're anxious, that when you talk about our attention narrows and we become more focused.
Yeah. I mean, that's the messy work of being human, right? We think if now we mental health professionals, who I think we've really profoundly failed people, if we're telling them, mental health means you're happy all the time and you should avoid all these destructive, dangerous emotions. I mean, it's a huge disservice, because what you're describing is to say, there's this emotional alchemy I need to actually have. I need to know that sometimes I need to be more anxious and not be afraid of it or think I'm broken. I need to learn to live with it and use it, but that takes time and skill and acceptance and engagement. And then sometimes I need to broaden. And I need to let go, and I need to get my body ready for Las Vegas or whatever it is that I need to do. And if we think of our emotions, the full range of them, not as dangerous, but as part of that messy work of being human, the alchemy of being able to sometimes be really angry when you need to overcome obstacles, and other times be super expansive and chill, and to work with that and find the right balance in your life. That is what the actual model for mental health should be. It should be more like fitness. It shouldn't be like a disease where you eradicate discomfort. It should be, this is fitness, I'm building skills.
I love your analogy. You say, think of anxiety like a smoke alarm, warning that your house is on fire. you would never just ignore that alarm, which is what we're telling people to do. Is we tell our kids, ignore it. No, you're not anxious. You're like, instead of leaning into it, let's medicate, let's take some pills, and that'll help the anxiety go away. But if I did that, if I just medicated, take college, let's say if I was stressed, I was going to flunk an exam.
Yeah.
That's my body telling me, you haven't studied enough, dude. You've missed some classes. Get your ass to the library.
100%.
And by the way, I'm not going to let you sleep at night until you go spend 12 hours at that library.
I mean, that's like a best friend, right? That's like a best friend.
Yeah, I couldn't sleep. So I would, I was an engineering degree at Purdue. It was hard.
Wow. That's intense. Yeah.
And if I couldn't sleep, I would just get up, pack my bag, and go to the library and study until I could sleep. And that was anxiety helping me pass tests. I shouldn't have medicated myself out of anxiety. I shouldn't have complained to my mom and said, Mom, I'm anxious about an exam. Yeah. Well, honey, maybe you have anxiety problems. Go take some pills. Bullshit. Go study more, or you're going to flunk that test.
And we Gen Xers, we know that. We were also raised where they let us play with broken glass and we were running in the woods, right? But the gift that we had was this notion that you can throw yourself in, and it's going to be hard, but you can do hard stuff. And that's what it takes to be an adult. And we are systematically denying our kids that opportunity, Frank, which kind of goes to the third part of what you were saying, I think, with how, with all the best intentions, we think that our job as parents is to snowplow out all the obstacles, all the sources of suffering. And we're treating our kids like they're fragile, like a teacup that you drop on the ground and it smashes into a million pieces, but kids are not fragile. And it's so crucial for us parents to change our mindset about our kids and what they're capable of.
I love this. This is one more. Hold on, Frank. Jump right in it. This is just the follow up on this that I love. This is something else that Tracy wrote. Anxiety works so well, not because it feels great to be anxious, just the opposite. It succeeds because it makes us feel so bad. This is called negative reinforcement. Stopping the anxious feeling is the reward. I absolutely think that is a dynamite passage. Talk about that.
Yeah, it's really taking this idea that's core to, if there's any advice in the book, there's a couple kind of guidelines. And one of them is anxiety is information. Listen to it. And that means when you feel anxious and when the anxiety goes away. So when you feel anxious, again, it's telling you what you care about. It's telling you there's something you need to do. It's telling you that there's something to attend to. And maybe there's a goal that you can make something amazing happen when you listen to it. And then when it goes away, maybe you're on the right track. Now, that doesn't mean you want to live on anxiety like a type A, super all the time. You need to learn to flow and work with it. But you have to listen to when it's up and when it's down. You have to actually take it as information that makes us better. So that's really, I think, at the heart of
But
of
if
that
anxiety
quote as
is
well.
if anxiety is just information, how do we know if that information is rational or irrational? What if we're worrying about everything and now we're just not getting, if someone's listening to this, what advice would you give them to try to decide whether that information's rational or irrational?
Yeah, that's the job of a lifetime's job, right? Of really understanding. But the first thing you have to do is actually listen to it, because that's what we don't even do. We don't even take that first step of saying, I'm going to be open to this for a second and consider when you're up at night and you can't sleep, saying, wait a second, maybe it's because I have to study for that test. So the first stage is to be open to it and listen. And once you do, you're going to gain skills. Once you engage and believe that you can work with this anxiety, that it's not dangerous or a dysfunction, you will start to figure out for yourself, when I'm anxious and it's keeping me up one time a month, that's still within a healthy range. But if it's actually starting to okay, I'm listening, I'm not hearing anything, I'm not getting what the useful information is, or it's really getting in the way. I'm actually failing my tests now, or I'm not going to work. And it's starting to actually, the way that you're trying to listen to and work with it is getting in your way. That's a good indication that it's not useful information at that point. And, see a therapist, exercise, take care of yourself, bring yourself back to the present moment. That's sort of the second guideline I talk about, that if it's not useful information after you listen to it, do something that immerses you in the present, that nourishes you, that takes care of yourself. Right.
Stop
and
watching
before
cable news.
Yeah, or
watching
maybe
cable news
once in
for
a
that.
yeah, don't watch cable news, but maybe you can binge a little Netflix. That's okay. Do something that just helps you press the reset button. Exercise is one of the best ways to do that. Whatever kind of, whether it's walking or a hard workout. I write poetry, terrible poetry, but I love writing poetry. It gets me in this totally different mindset. Connect with friends, see your therapist, do those things, right? And then it allows you to loop back and say, okay, let me reevaluate. Is there useful information? How do I hitch it to a sense of purpose? Something I want from life, something I really am driven for. How do I use that anxiety to advance me? That's sort of the 3 steps I think we can all go through and gain skills in.
So I had enough exposure to kids through cousins and nephews, and Ian's kids are older than, so I've had plenty of exposure to kids, but when you were talking about this, it made me think of something that we didn't write down in our prep, but it's this, and maybe you studied it or maybe you learned it from your own kids, but when do humans feel anxiety for the first time? And like when it's actionable, like, did you go back that far on like when do we recognize, if we're being honest, when do we recognize it first?
So I'm also, in addition to being a clinical psychologist and training in neuroscience, I'm a developmental psychologist as well. So I've always I've always been really, just to say, I have cred, but I really, I think we develop across the lifespan, right? But it's what you want to think about as a developmentalist is what is hard for kids, but also expected. And anxiety is an expected piece of development. It's an expected stage. And really you want to see some stranger anxiety around a year-old. We hitch all sorts of assumptions about healthy child development on the idea that they will distinguish between their family and their community and a stranger. So that's very early. Fear of the dark, a normal developmental stage. Around 8 or 9, when kids are in this, what Freud called a latency period. Latency meaning like you're not hot for your mom or dad. Seriously. Anyway, because it was all psycho.
Ian, you perv.
Wait, I'm the one who said it. Ian got the blame. So, sorry, Ian. But in this it's 8 or 9, that's when anxieties increase. So when my kids were 8 and 9, almost like clockwork, they developed one of fear of strangers breaking into our house and another of bugs. And then they worked through it. So it is expected, it's actionable from the beginning in the sense that you don't, and this is, I think, some of the most important research out there when it comes to kids and anxiety. You can't over accommodate those fears in the sense that you can't just day after day, month after month, remove all of the exposure to those things. You have to slowly help kids work through it. Because, when kids become very seriously anxious, what happens is parents over accommodate. They're anxious about going to school or leaving the house. Okay, you don't have to go to school. You can sleep in my bed every night. It's once that's okay, but if that becomes a habit, it's not a good norm, and it actually deepens these problems with anxiety. So we can work through it very early on, and you do it kind of systematically, steady and slow. That's the best way usually, but we can do it with our kids.
Because I have we talked about this, I have a 3.5-year-old and I have a 16-month-old. And as soon as you started talking about the 1-year-olds, like he's very expressive for somebody. He doesn't have any words, but he can point. And when you said the thing about like knowing, like no stranger danger, like he's really good at those things and kind of understands the edge.
I love that you said he's good at it. It's a skill.
Yeah.
It is a skill. So what if we parents were so anxious about our kids' anxiety? What if we started saying, okay, there's costs and benefits to everything, but this is also a strength. Like this, my anxious kid, he's going to be an engineer. He's going to be a scientist. He's going to be an artist because he cares enough to get it right because he's a little anxious.
It comes down to the parent to understand it. Like when my youngest was like 3 weeks old, I noticed he followed something with his eyes that his brother hadn't done until he was almost 3 months old. So you just realize pretty quickly, because you're aware and you care, and it's your children, you're like, he seems to be pretty perceptive. And exactly, you give them an ability, even though he's only 1. You don't let him play up against a highway, but at the same time, you give him some kind of rope to kind of lean into those things and kind of develop it.
Yeah, I have a real beef with the mental health industry, the self-help industry, because we've taught parents, it's almost predatory at this stage, that we're convincing parents that they don't know what they're doing, that they should be very frightened about their kids, and that we're all very vulnerable. And that is, listen, I think most of it's the best of intentions.
I
But
love
that
that book,
we have to actually be much more punk rock about mental health and child development. We have to say, this is the mental health industrial complex. This is Gen X speaking, so you understand exactly what I'm saying right now. But this is this complex that's not serving us, that we're part of this unhelpful machine, creating people who are vulnerable instead of anti-fragile, which is actually what we are. We gain from challenge. We gain from having to work and strain and try our best to do hard things.
Frankie, I think what you'll see is when your boys get a little bit older to where they start taking tests and they care what their teacher thinks and what their peers think, and when they get into sports, you're going to see anxiety start to ratchet up. So some of my favorite conversations with my kids have been around sports, right? Where my son will say, I'm really stressed about this game on Thursday. And I'll be like, what are you stressed about? Well, they have a really good pitcher. Well, what could happen? I'm trying to figure out, are you scared you're going to get hit? And no, that's not it. I don't, I want to win. And well, what are you stressed about though? I don't want to strike out. Okay. Well, do you want to just skip the game? No, of course not. I love baseball. Okay. Then what is in your control if you don't want to strike out? Well, can we go to the batting cages? Yeah, we can go. You have a tee in the backyard. Why don't you swing 200-300 times? Is that better? Will that help you not strike out? Or should you just sit and worry about Thursday for 3 days and do nothing? Because if that's what you do, you're definitely striking out. So you might as well not even be stressed, because not doing anything and worrying means you're guaranteeing your future. But if you don't want to strike out, why are you not in the backyard right now hitting into that net? That's what you should do. Let's lean into that anxiety.
And that's the gift of anxiety, and a parent like you who can help a child navigate that. Because I'm sure you said, oh, you don't want to go to the game. I'm sure you weren't going to be like, okay, let's not go to the game. You were helping him for himself really think through, why are you in it? Why do you care? What can you do? Yeah, giving him agency. I think that's fantastic. And that's the gift of anxiety when we work through
Go do what's in your control. Go do what you think you can do. You tell a great story about the Rubin Museum of Art. And we started to talk about hope and anxiety earlier. Can you talk about that exhibit and the conversation you had with your children?
Yeah, so the Rubin Museum is one of my favorite museums in the city. It's small. It's downtown in Manhattan, devoted to Himalayan art. And so there's a lot of Buddhist art, Hindu art, and just beautiful pieces. And they also have modern artists. And there was an installation there called the Monument for the Anxious and Hopeful. And I've taken my kids there since they were small. So we walk in one day and there's this big display on one of the walls. And you see, it's a little confusing at first. You're like, well, why? There are all these red little placards, like little, almost like Post-it notes on one side of the wall, and the other side, they're blue ones. And there's a table there. So you kind of walk up and then you're like, oh, my daughter, of course, was one of the first to notice what this was about. She's like, oh, they want us to make the art. So what the little tabs on the table said is, I am anxious because, or I am hopeful because. And so you can pick any of them. You write what you're anxious about, you write what you're hopeful about, and you put it up on the wall, the red side for anxiety, the blue side for hope. And so, my kids were at the time, they must have been, 5 and 8 or 6 and 9. And so they were writing and they were putting things up. And my son started noticing that there were some patterns in what people had written. So you'd see on the anxiety side, I'm anxious because I have a job interview. And then right next to it on the hope side, I'm hopeful because I have a job interview. And it would be, and there were just quite a few of these replications where anxiety and hope were just two sides of the same coin. And the artists who developed this, who created this piece, Candy Chang and James Reeves, they wrote about this piece, that anxiety and hope are twins in a way, because they both are about the moment that has yet to arrive. They're about the future. They're about uncertainty, but uncertainty, it holds all this possibility. Just like creativity. Creativity is about the uncertain future. It holds all these potentialities. And I thought it was so beautiful that my kids could experience that.
Yeah.
Just in kind of interacting with this art.
Yeah, I love that. And so the person who says I am hopeful for a job interview versus the person who says I am anxious for a job interview, is there could there be a difference in their mindsets going into that? Or is it really they're both saying the exact same thing and they just used a different word?
No, I think it's very powerful difference. And I spoke to someone about this the other day. I was sharing this idea of hope and anxiety being flipped, two sides of the same coin. And she said, that makes so much sense, but it matters which one you choose, because she's like, I've started to think of myself as this anxious person, but that doesn't fit who I think of as my personality or what I do in the world. And what I've realized is I'm not a person who struggles with anxiety. I'm actually a person who struggles with hope. And everything changes when you change that equation. So I think it's very much mindset, because not because of what anxiety by the textbook definition means, but what do we mean when we say anxiety? We mean that it's danger, destructive, I'm broken, right? We have this sense that it's the danger aspect of it, and that we can't think about that. It's not really about positive possibilities at all. Even though I argue in the book that the truth is anxiety allows us to see both. So when we use but I'd love us to rejigger the world, kind of reclaim the word anxiety, so that we really understand that it means at the same time, anxiety, hope, possibility, potential.
When I think about why I would use those words different, so this is an interview of sorts. We're interviewing you. It's not a job interview. But a week ago, I was anxious about this interview, and I told my wife this morning what I was doing today, and I said I am super excited about this interview I'm doing. And here's the function. Here's the reason why I would use those. And a week ago, I told her I'm a little anxious about it. Here's why. I hadn't finished the book and I hadn't written the outline. And so when I think about the difference between hopeful or excited and anxious, when I use those two words in a situation, it comes down to preparedness for me. So if I were to tell someone I'm anxious about a speech I have to give, it probably means I didn't practice it enough. I hadn't scripted it. I wasn't happy with the script. I hadn't done enough research on the audience, on what I was going to be talking about. And I hadn't sat in a room by myself and prepared and recited it so many times that I knew it by heart. Because when I've done those things, I'm never nervous or anxious about a presentation. I don't care. I've just done it enough. But when I am anxious, it's usually because I'm not prepared. And when someone tells me I'm anxious and I don't know what to do about a speech or a presentation, my first question is always, how many times have you practiced it?
That's so interesting. I love that, because anxiety is on this spectrum, right? So it's not a light switch, like you're anxious or you're not. It includes your gut instinct, that tummy test, right? It includes excited. It includes, but what you're saying is that with our mindset, the way we use it, that anxiety, it doesn't include those good things like excited. It's really, for me, for you, and for many of us, an indicator of, I don't think I'm going to be able to be good enough. I need to, there's still work to be done. And that's very interesting. I mean, do you think it would help to call it sort of nerve excited from the beginning? Like, I'm nervous excited, or I'm like, is that helpful? Or does it help you to think about anxiety as something?
So I'm going to stop you there, because I think that's avoidance again. I think, so I would argue with you, no, it was great that I was anxious. And the reason I was anxious, I was very excited that you were coming on our show because I really loved your book. And I didn't want to blow it. I didn't want to waste your time, because I'm respectful that you wanted to come talk to us. And I wanted everyone to hear all the greatness of the book and be as excited as I was. And if I would have tried to sugarcoat it of I'm excited and like, I think it was good that I was anxious, because it forced me to be like, Frank, if you bought the book yet, you need to read the book, Frank. If write down all my notes into my outline, check it out. It's in the Dropbox, start looking at it, call Frank again to see if he's read the book. I'm
a real deadbeat.
How nice.
Real deadbeat.
Well, this is why it's a good partnership. This is a good partnership.
Frank, it doesn't count that you made your employees read the book. Did you read it? So you're saying
it should stay, then this makes sense. And I'm certainly not suggesting you sugarcoat it. But what interests me, though, is that you are a person who's good with anxiety. So you are already a sort of an alchemist of anxiety. So you don't need to change your mindset about it in that way. So maybe that is exactly right. You shouldn't. But what about someone who, when they feel any of that anxiety, they consider it a danger and it shuts them down rather than sends them to action? Maybe it's for those folks that this sort of, let's just like rethink it. Yes, it's unpleasant, but it's not bad. I think you're already there, Ian, frankly. I think you're already, but that's an interesting, like, how do we change the language when all of us have different relationships with anxiety? I'm not sure.
So we've gone over this. My wife's PhD. I'm married to a linguist. She teaches.
Oh yeah, what did she say?
So I didn't ask her this specific question, but I'm going to tonight.
Yeah.
One of the things that you just said, like, she's taught me about all other cultures. Like right now in our society now, like sex or help me, I'm losing the word. Gender is more fluid, right? So she goes into the fluidity of gender in other societies and talks about how it's not just two in every society, it's more, and it's more fluid.
Mm-hmm.
But using something that's, back to the words, do we, like, this is a fear. And one of the things I really want to kind of close with you is kind of like social media. And I want to talk a little bit about like kids and like that whole thing, which we'll get to in a second. But like the thing that I think about with this is like, will the medical industry allow us to introduce another word? Like, is there another word that, like, is anxiety the right word, or are there stages of it, or should there be something that we're not talking about? Like, there's a process of anxiety. There's the initial, and then there's that moment of like there, but there's levels to it, and we don't think of it in that way. We just think of it as this, like you said, it's an on or an off switch, but it isn't. And like Ian's point with his son or himself or like me, when we go and do something, usually anxiety fades because of incredible preparedness, or like you had anxiety when you had 100 blank pages. My guess is when you had 90 pages of the written word, you had less anxiety because you're further in the process.
Yeah. Well, that's a very good point. My approach has been to argue we need to reclaim the word and then understand with this emotional granularity that there are all these aspects to it.
Right.
So, I mean, that's what I would be, I would kind of say it's a kind of parsimonious to say, it's sort of like, let's stick with what we have, but let's actually have a different conversation about it. So that now we understand that anxiety is also hope. It's possibility. It is a bad feeling, and there are nuances to it. It's your gut instinct. It's the butterflies in your stomach. It's the full-blown, it's all those things. But we can start to understand that the good and the bad and the ugly and all of that is a part of this normal human experience, and that doesn't have to be pathologized. I mean, maybe that's too complex, but that's sort of how my brain works on it.
You say, so on this topic, you say our brains don't ignore uncertainty, they lean into it. Without our expending any conscious effort, our brain does two things surprisingly well. It notices the uncertainty, and then it does everything it can to control it. And I think that resonates with me so much, because I feel like every time I'm anxious, it just gets me off my ass to take out. So for our tech startup, we're like 3 levels into with casting directors trying to get onto Shark Tank. And we've made it to like the final deal on it. And I've been very anxious about this lately, because that's obviously a very big presentation, and I've been thinking about it. But every time I'm anxious about it, what I find myself doing is I go start watching old Shark Tank episodes with pen and paper.
Good research.
And it brings my anxiety down, because right now, the reason why I'm anxious is I'm not in control. I'm waiting on casting directors to call us back. And it's this awful process of waiting forever and thinking about what's this uncertain future that I'm also very hopeful for, right? A lot of good things come.
That's why you're anxious. Yeah, that's right.
But when I feel anxious, I find that just by watching Shark Tank episodes, because that's research, that's prep, that's looking at what pitches work, what don't work, I find that my anxiety goes down by watching and taking notes and getting thoughts, talking to my partner about, what we might do with it, even though it's no certainty we're going to get on the show. It's hard to get on the show. But when I feel anxiety, it forces me to go do something, even though it's not really getting me totally ready, but it's doing something.
100%. It's an activating emotion. And, some emotions like sadness deactivate us. They get us to rest and recover, not anxiety. And, the thing about, you watching those Shark Tank episodes and, and taking notes, is this is, again, you're simulating this future. You're doing everything you can to exert control. And listen, I could die tomorrow in a plane crash. There's no certainty. The only, but that whole chapter, I devoted a whole chapter to uncertainty. And Bill, my editor, Bill said, could you write a whole chapter without mentioning anxiety? I was like, huh, let me try. And so you'll notice in that chapter, I don't
Hmm.
use the word anxiety till I get to the last couple paragraphs.
Interesting.
Because really you cannot be anxious without uncertainty. There's nothing, the future is only uncertain, but anxiety is that emotion that is in that space in between. And it's what sticks us to doing everything in our power, even if it's illusory control.
Yeah.
And you could be an existential
Anxiety
psychologist.
doesn't let you be a
but
victim. It doesn't, anxiety
won't
won't
let
let you feel sorry for yourself and be a victim. It forces
No.
you to get off your ass and do something.
It does. And
Takes
it makes
nothing.
us feel weak. But once we stop doing that, we're like, yeah, actually, it makes us feel strong. Like I have to do something. I have to stop just being inactive and start being active.
Ian and I were having a conversation before you magically appeared on our screens.
And
if you're cool with Ian, I'd like to end with it, which is kind of the anxiety we feel as younger people that we kind of move into, we kind of get away from. But the one thing I want to talk about before we do the kind of the close is this. You talk about the comparison between social media and a casino. And Ian and I already talked about our affinity for Vegas, and we do like casinos.
Yeah.
And the thing you talk about in the book is how like casinos, there's no right angles, like everything kind of meanders, the hallways, right? And it's kind of like with the endless scroll.
Mm-hmm.
So the things that I worry about as a young dad are drugs with my kids. And I worry about like the effects of social media. We've kind of touched on drugs a little bit. I would really like to kind of talk a little bit about your perception or what your thoughts are around social media and how that kind of feeds into anxiety. And you've already kind of given us a couple of clues where I think you think it's going, but I really wanted to just address that.
It's crucial. We've often laid the blame for society's anxiety at the feet of social media. And I think that's wrong because that's very binary. It's like It's all bad or it's all good. The reality is there's lots of bad, toxic stuff about the social media ecosystem and the way it was built on purpose for the profit of these companies. I mean, full stop, right? It's not made for us humans. But it's not going away. So to say, oh, it's destroying a generation or it's all good, it's no problem, those aren't going to lead to real solutions. What's going to lead to solutions is to dig into the nuances, which no one really likes to do, especially in this world where we want very screaming headlines. But when it comes to our kids, these screens are not going away. We have to teach them to be digital citizens. What does that mean? They have to understand how it works. They have to take responsibility, and they have to look for opportunities to actually do useful, productive, happy-making things in their life, right? So if you start doom scrolling, you're going to feel crappy. There's just no second word about it. And if we teach our kids to tune into, well, okay, you want to be on the screen. What do you want to do and why? How does it make you feel? Let's take a moment. Oh, that makes you feel bad? What makes you feel good? And starting to hone little by little our children's ability to make some of those choices. Now, I think we should make it for them in the beginning. Right. I don't think young kids should be on screens much at all because it becomes an opportunity cost to what they actually need to do. Yep. My kids, I allow them to be on screens, but we monitor and manage. And I make sure it's not an opportunity cost for my son who's a pianist and composer and loves to write and do other things, and it's not getting in the way of my daughter who loves to swim and who is a creator in so many ways. So I think that's how we parents should think about it. Number one, digital citizens. And then number two, anxiety is amplified when we try to escape and avoid it, right? And social media is one big giant escape machine. So if we find that we are using it to just escape uncomfortable experiences, if our kids are doing that habitually, that will get in their way and that might amplify anxiety. So we have to look for those patterns and disrupt them.
So you could say social media is creating a mental health dilemma, or you could look at it and say a mental health dilemma, which is us running away from anxiety, is pushing us over to social media to go escape.
Oh, it's much more of that's a good point. It's a much more
am I on social
cycle.
media because I'm avoiding anxiety, or am I getting anxious by being there? Sometimes, why am I on here so much? It's because I'm avoiding something I should be doing in the future that I'm anxious about.
Yeah, and it's just so optimized to suck us in, obviously the casino, analogy. But here's the other thing that I think is actually more dangerous about social media, and what we talk much less about it. It's that we have been made to feel, especially our kids who are growing up on screens, that we are products to be consumed. So we are brands. We have to sell ourselves. We've been gamified to get, where what is valued is by your likes and your clicks and your followers. And so what's actually validated and incentivized are the shallowest part of ourselves, and kids are developing selves in these crucibles, and they're made to value this kind of uber consumerism.
Yeah.
And that they themselves are consumed and they are to consume. And it disrupts our ability to find purpose in life and to find something that's greater than ourselves to work for. I think that's the danger, honestly.
What advice would you give Frank when he starts feeling bad that whenever we post something on social media, it gets a lot more likes when I'm doing more of the talking than the ones where he's doing the talking? Because his engagement sucks.
I'm just here to help Ian's ego. You don't even need
to
wade into these waters.
You're not part of
a lot of angst and dread.
Frank, you're not part of the machine, man. Sorry, Ian, you're a sellout. I know that means something to you because we're all the same age. No one cares about that anymore, by the way. I mean, I am really into being
just me.
No one cares about being a sellout. No one.
You talk about how anxiety drives creativity, especially like periods of high anxiety. And there's so many stories about one of Frank and I, we love the book Phil Knight, his Nike book, Shoe Dog. And that whole book is just one existential crisis after the next of him trying to like make payroll and get the next loan. And every time it's like he's about to not get the next loan and go bankrupt, he gets this aha moment, like, and completely revolutionizes the industry. Elon Musk talks about it, how many times he's been days away from not making payroll with Tesla, like with big companies. What is it about anxiety that drives the most creative moments that we have?
I mean, and these guys are masters of anxiety, right? Because anxiety is when you're facing that uncertain future, how do you make your dreams come true? That's what it is. That's what the emotion is for. It's not some vestigial organ to like battle the cave bear. You know, it's this civilization builder. So, so when you're, with creativity is about bringing something into existence that's never existed before in quite that way. And so it is this uncomfortable space. Every creative person knows that distance between where you are now and what where you want to be. And that's where anxiety lives as well. So what anxiety does is it supercharges us through that space to move into this future, this creative future. And I think it also sort of helps us know that we care about what we're doing. We persist through obstacles. I mean, the research that's been done on looking at anxiety and creativity, it does cool stuff, like it induces anxiety in people, makes them feel more anxious, compares that to when you're feeling sad or happy. And then you measure things like how many solutions do you come up with? How innovative are those solutions when you have to do a problem-solving task? How much do you persist through obstacles? And anxiety wins in that contest every single time. In some of these very well conducted studies. So I think that anxiety actually makes us more innovative, not less. It helps us push through harder, not choking us, when we actually befriend it like an ally that we need to negotiate with, but it's still there to be our ally.
I love that. If a manager, Tracy, has a poor performing employee who's just clearly anxious, how could that manager help this person learn from their anxiety and take action rather than getting into this doom, spiral where the more anxiety, the less they do? I've seen it happen where people just like, they're worried they're going to lose their job, and then they do less and they perform worse, and someone talks to them, and then they do, this anxiety just keeps getting there until it becomes a reality. How can a manager better coach an employee who works for them who has a lot of anxiety?
I think there are two things, and it also requires the culture of the company to be consistent with this. But I think the first thing is you call out that cycle for what it is, not in a pathologizing way, but you say, hey, I want to talk to you. I think there might be some anxiety you're experiencing, and what you're doing with it is that it's making you avoid. It's making you not take the chances. It's making you not follow through. And when you avoid, that's when the trouble starts. And so calling that cycle out first, I think, is important. And avoidance is the key. It's the linchpin on that. And then the second thing is to create a culture where it's really an excellencist culture, right? Where you really convince that employee, and you walk the talk, that making mistakes is how we advance if you call them out and don't hide your head in the sand. So, I've run a research lab for 20 years, as well as being, founding a startup. And if you shy away, I've had students like in my lab who made some mistake early on and were too anxious to point it out. And so then you have this error. It's like you have this broken cog or this broken piece, and everything's built on top of that. And then we would discover it months later, in one case, like a year later, and the whole data set was destroyed, millions of dollars of NIH funding out the window. And so I learned from that to really let my students and my employees in the company know, when we see something wrong, when there's a mistake, you lean into it, we fix it together, because we're going to make things better when we can discover that. And so having that, what I think of as a growth mindset, excellencist culture, I think is the second key ingredient to helping an employee with that.
And that's very different from a concept that you coin as emotional snowplowing. You talk about it with kids, but I've seen managers do this with employees, where they kind of try to talk them out of their anxiety, or you're not being ready. They kind of talk over that person instead of letting them really say, here's why I'm not sleeping at night, boss. This is what is on my mind. They tend to just kind of like you were doing with your son who didn't want to ride his bike.
Oh, yeah.
You were telling him that he's being silly, and you're
I was
not
essentially
stressed.
telling him to man up, and not so many words. Like, oh, you're not anxious, you're not scared. I was shaming him. I was doing the opposite of what I'm telling you guys.
Yeah.
It was, and I recorded myself by mistake, and I transcribed that into the beginning of the chapter. So it was a massive parent fail.
None of us.
But you come back from none of it. But you can come back from it. I love that, Ian, to think about this managerial relationship, not as parenting in a condescending way, but more as we are here to cultivate a coaching way. And if you're snow plowing around, and it's very easy to do that now because of safe spaces, and we feel like we are in charge of the mental health of our employees, and we put that on managers, that's not the right place for it to be. So, so this whole idea we have to soothe and comfort, it's not going to lead to anything good in the end. You have to help people acknowledge it, be real, not be ashamed, and then work through it together.
Yeah, emotional snow plowing, like those words come out as it's okay, everything's gonna be all right, don't worry about it. And what you're saying there is you're just snow plowing their emotion out of the way. Don't let them discover, just kind of talk over it and try to convince them that they can just get through it, when the truth is you need to, like, what are you really anxious about? Well, truthfully, that deadline was set 4 weeks earlier than any of us think we got a chance of doing it. Wow, let's look at that. Why'd you say that? What would it take to hit the deadline? We need 3 more people, and our system needs to work. Like, by asking them to tell you why they're anxious, they bring up real world things that are in their way, that are resistance to hit their goal, that you could help with as a manager.
And probably crucial information that you as a manager might not have access to, because you're not boots on the ground with every detail. So no, and we who, are managing people, we want to say, we just don't want problems, if that's our mindset, right? We're just like, oh, I just want this done. But you have to have the courage to take a chance and do the messier work. It's going to yield, though, I think, tenfold when you do. So I think that's a great analogy. And
I think the last thing that that I'll ask just about is, Frank and I talked about this earlier, and I can talk to myself. When I was in college, right after college, I felt like I was a much more anxious person. I feel like I had a lot more general anxiety and than I do today at 46 years old. And I think part of the reason, when I look at it, is at 21, 22, you're worried about, how am I going to make a living and pay the rent? How am I going to find someone to marry? Am I going to have kids when I get older? Am I going to have enough to, am I going to make it in a career? What is my career? What path am I going to choose? Today, 25 years later, I've answered a lot of those questions. And so the big ticket things that you worry about in your future, I think it's almost like the Maslow's structure, the hierarchy. I've covered a lot of the base of the pyramid. A lot of the things that maybe I worry about are kind of a little more aspirational today. But as a kid, I worried about everything because I had so many. Like, what advice would you give someone who's starting their career, who's new in their career, who's worrying about everything, like a just general anxiety, so many question marks in my future?
I mean, I feel for young people today, because what you're describing, even when we were kids, is this uncertainty, right? And uncertainty is on hyperdrive now, right? And the pandemic, I mean, all of the, kind of social change, economic change, we can't count on the American dream anymore quite the way that we thought we could when we were growing up. So you have to, so this is what kids are reacting to. And my advice is actually something I learned from a young college student who I've been talking a lot to. And she's amazing. She's very active in sort of digital wellness advocacy work. And she said something to me just a couple of weeks ago. She said, I've been thinking a lot about my peers and how we all feel, just what you're describing, Ian, like all this kind of anxiety about this uncertainty and everything's going to hell in a handbasket. And she said, but the problem that my friends have is that they think that they're so vulnerable and fragile that they're just going to go off the rails and break at any point. But she said, what I've realized is I've started to look inward and trust myself more and gotten off social media more, actually for her in that case, is that I can't be shaken. She's like, I actually, even if the winds are kind of blowing me and the uncertainty is there, she's like, who I am and the value I have cannot be shaken. And the way that she really started cultivating that for herself, I think, was hitching herself to a deep sense of purpose in what she does in life. For her, that's been mental health and digital wellness advocacy. She's an incredible young woman. She actually was featured in the Facebook Files when they did that article and had Anastasia as her name, and had this young woman who was sort of talking about her experience on social media. And so she essentially stopped thinking of herself as this product or as like needing all these likes on social media, and really dug in to what she wants in life and what she can achieve and what she can contribute to. And she realized, you know what, I can't be shaken. It's okay. Even if I get knocked down, I'll get back up. And so I think for us, for kids, and for us who love them and can support them, help them find what that is for them. And it doesn't need to be grand. It can be, I'm going to volunteer at my local YMCA every weekend and make a difference in one kid's life. It can be, I'm going to take a chance and go out on this, I'm going to camp across Europe. And that's going to be something that's going to change but we need to help kids decouple themselves from the sense that there's some brand to sell, and that they're constantly, just this ugly thing they have to do to get what they feel to get ahead, and to recenter themselves in what matters to them, what gives them joy, and what gives them purpose.
I really like that. Frank, you and I have talked before too, as Tracy's talking, just as we wrap this up, we've always kind of joked, like when people would ask us what our 10-year plan was in our careers, we would just kind of stare. Like, I feel like when you're younger, you feel like you should know your 10-year plan or your 5-year plan. And I guess that my advice to anyone would just be, that's bull. I had no idea. I had no idea when I was 21 that I would be on a podcasts weren't even around.
Yeah.
The tech startup I'm doing, I didn't know I'd be doing that 5 years ago. Like, I think whenever I get stressed, I'm thinking too far into the future, and you can't control too far into the future. I think a good way to wrap is coming back to Tracy writing this book. She had a goal to write a book and to deliver it within a year. But what got her through it was every 2 weeks, she had to submit a chapter to her editor. So it's break down some of those big picture goals. You can't go be president if you're not a good sales rep in an entry level. Like, be good at that first, then go to the next level. I think a lot of that youth, when I was stressed, I would start thinking too far ahead of myself. And the mountain felt very high, instead of just thinking of, let me get to the next base camp. Like, what's the next base camp? I can control that. I can do something about that.
You have the breakdown, you have social connection. So I had this amazing editor, like you guys have each other. I'm sure you guys keep each other going, right?
Yeah.
And you
Ian writes me handwritten notes all the time.
Exactly.
I am an incredible coach to Frank.
And you know that uncertainty is possibility. It's like, I feel like it's structure, it's breaking it down, but it's broadening to our best resources, each other, and forging that, and knowing that there's it's exciting. As you said, you can be nervous, but you can be excited about that uncertainty. You can find possibility, but we have to give our kids the support to really realize that all of those things are possible.
So I think a life well lived includes anxiety, and I think it must include anxiety, but a life well lived, to me, and my definition of it, includes an understanding of how to handle it. I own real estate. So with real estate comes debt. I'm not some rich person that just has tons of money I have to raise, either equity or debt. Both of them are basically debt. So I remember, like, shortly after the pandemic started and I was like locked in my house, and I have a gorgeous house, I'm looking out the window and I'm thinking like the earth is going to come spinning off its axis at any moment. And it didn't. We all made it, like, with it still spinning. But you have to, like, even for people who are pretty well adept at dealing with anxiety, you do sometimes need to give yourself a reality check and just like take a deep breath and realize what everything you said fundamentally, from a college student who's in their 20s, or Ian when he was worried in his 20s, to someone that's, you dealt with a heart failure in a child, like these are big things, and you have to kind of ground yourself very quickly, and then you start to say, what can I control, what can I not control, how can I work through it? But for younger people that listen to us or have read this, like what I think is, how do you not get surprised as much over time? How does anxiety have less of a toll each time you deal with it? How is it less stressful? Because there comes a time, like to Ian's point, like 20s are awesome because you're lean and you're fit and you're skinny. For fat people like me, like we worry about that. But like but what happens is there's angst too, because you don't have some of these things. You don't take chips off the table. You don't make life less. You give yourself a little bit of a cushion. And like what Ian was saying, the top of the triangle is more aspirational. That's where life gets to be fun. You don't maybe have some of the stuff you had earlier from physical or anxiety, but you can build it. And I like if you said summarize this whole book for me, I would say this: anxiety is real. You shouldn't avoid it. Lean into it. And if you turn and allow it to push you, it can take you to incredible heights. And what you gave us was a couple hundred pages of more vocabulary around something that a lot of people try to either medicate or avoid. And I think that's doing yourself a disservice.
I love that, Frank. I think that's beautifully said.
So we can wrap up here. What I will say, Tracy, both Frank and I read dozens and dozens of books every year, and very few stick with me. This is one that will stick with me for a long time. It's a very simple premise that you do a beautiful job of writing about and telling amazing stories about it. I've already talked to my kids about it. Here we are sharing it. So if you are listening to this, we highly suggest you go get it. We are going to put, you can get it on Amazon. We're going to put the link in our show notes. Anywhere else where people can find you if they want to follow you, Tracy?
Yeah, well, there's so my website's drtracyphd.com, and I'm on Instagram, fortunately or unfortunately,
Yes.
Dr. Tracy PhD. On Twitter, which I like to use once in a while, Tracy A. Dennis. That was back in the day.
Well, fantastic. I am
thank
no
you.
longer anxious about this episode, Frank, because it was over. We can say a win. Tracy, how did we do?
Amazing. And Ian and Frank, thank you so much for having me on. It really was a great, fun, and insightful conversation, and I learned a lot from you guys. So thanks a lot.
We enjoyed
We
it.
appreciate you being here very much.
You have more degrees than any guest we've ever had on here. So congratulations. That's really impressive.
You have to get your wife on, Frank.
I'm trying.
We got to get her to listen to an episode or two first.
That's it.
This is
giving me anxiety.
You gotta get into peer review time.
Ellie just got enough of us to deal with without having to listen to our podcast.
Well, thanks again, guys. Great speaking with you.
Thank you so much,
Pleasure.
Tracy.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.